I want to tell you something my grandfather told me when I was about 8 years old, standing barefoot on the back porch of his farmhouse in western Tennessee. The boards were soft and sun-warmed under my feet, and the air smelled like cut grass and something sweet I could never name. He handed me a small brown paper bag and said, "Boy, you hold the answer to half your problems right there." I looked inside and saw nothing but a white powder that looked like table salt. I didn't understand then. I thought he was being strange, the way old men sometimes are when they want to seem wise. I set the bag down on the railing, went back to chasing the dog around the yard, and forgot about it for 30 years. I wish I hadn't. Because here's the thing nobody tells you when you walk into a home improvement store and stare down an aisle that stretches so long you can't see the end of it. Every bottle on those shelves, every brightly colored container with a skull and crossbones warning and a price tag that makes you flinch. Almost none of it is solving a problem your grandparents couldn't solve for pennies. Not because your grandparents were smarter, not because modern chemistry is a scam, but because somewhere between their generation and ours, we stopped passing things down. We stopped trusting the knowledge that lived in kitchens and barns and those brown paper bags on sun-warmed porch railings. What I want to share with you today costs about $2. You probably have it in your house right now. It's been sitting on a shelf somewhere between your baking soda and your dish soap, and you've walked past it 100 times without a second thought. The companies that make the other stuff, the sprays, the traps, the pellets, the quarterly pest control contracts, they're not going to tell you about it. There's no money in it for them. You can't trademark a mineral that's been pulled out of the California desert since 1872. My grandfather knew about it. His father knew about it. Somewhere along the line, that knowledge stopped traveling from old hands to young ones, and a whole industry grew up in the space that silence left behind. Let me back up. The summer I was 8, my mother had a problem. We all had problems that summer, actually. It was hot, it was dry, and the farmhouse had been sitting on that hill for 60 years, attracting every creature that wanted shelter from both. But her particular problem was a thin black line of ants that had found a way from the garden, across the porch, through a gap in the kitchen doorframe, and straight to the corner cabinet where she kept her flour. Every morning she'd find them. Every morning she'd sweep them out, seal the canister a little tighter, and they'd be back by noon. She didn't drive to a store. She didn't call anyone. She walked out to the shed, came back with that same brown paper bag my grandfather had shown me, and she mixed the white powder with something sweet. I think it was a little powdered sugar, maybe a tiny amount of something else I couldn't identify at the time. And she set small flat piles of it along the base of the porch railing where the ants were traveling. By the third day, the line was gone. I asked her what it was. She said, "Borax." She said it the same way she'd say salt or vinegar, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, because to her it was. To her generation, it was a household word. It was the thing that lived under the sink or up on the laundry shelf, doing quiet work without anyone making a fuss about it. I've spent the better part of the last 2 decades going back to that knowledge, reading old farming almanacs, going through my grandfather's notebooks, actual handwritten notebooks with water-stained pages and pencil that's faded to gray in the margins, talking to older farmers, the kind who've been working the same land for 40 and 50 years and still think in terms of what's in the barn, not what's in the catalog. And what I keep finding is this: the gap between what used to be common knowledge and what we now pay for is enormous. Not just in money, though, that adds up fast. In confidence, in that feeling of walking out to your garden or your kitchen and knowing that you're not helpless, that the problem in front of you is something you can address with your hands and something that costs less than a cup of coffee. I'm not selling you anything. I never am. What I'm going to show you in the rest of this video is 11 specific problems. the kind that send people to that endless store aisle, the kind that rack up real costs season after season. And I'm going to show you how my grandfather, and farmers like him across this country, handled them with one simple substance that's been used since before anyone reading this was born. If you're watching this right now, I want you to do one thing. Leave a comment with your state and the single pest or garden problem that bothers you the most this time of year. I read every one of those comments, and I'll answer you directly. I want to know what you're dealing with because what I'm about to show you almost certainly applies. My grandfather handed me that brown paper bag and said I was holding the answer to half my problems. He wasn't wrong. He just waited too long to explain it. I'm not going to make that same mistake. Let me start with something my grandfather wrote in the margin of one of his notebooks. It's just a single line, penciled in small, careful letters at the top of a page that listed his spring planting dates. It says, "A man who knows his pantry is never at the mercy of a catalog." I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count, because the truth it carries is simple. The knowledge existed before the products did. The products just arrived later, made the knowledge seem unnecessary, and charged you monthly for the privilege of forgetting. What follows is 11 specific situations, real problems, the kind that cost real money when you don't know what your grandfather knew. I'll tell you the problem, why the solution works, the exact proportions, and where the knowledge comes from. Let's get into it. 1. Ant trails in and around the house. You've seen the line. It appears overnight, travels from a crack in the baseboard or a gap under the door, and heads somewhere purposeful, toward sugar, toward moisture, toward whatever they've decided belongs to them now. Mix 1 part borax with 3 parts powdered sugar. Set it on a flat piece of cardboard or a small shallow lid wherever you see activity. Don't disturb it. The ants take it back to the colony and share it. Within 3 to 5 days, the trail is gone. Texas A&M's Agriculture Extension has documented this approach for decades. The sugar draws them in. The borax disrupts their digestive system at a cellular level. The colony collapses from the inside. My grandfather called it feeding the problem its solution. 2. Slugs destroying seedlings overnight. You plant something, go to bed, wake up to stems that look like someone went at them with a hole punch. Slugs. They move at night, and they hate one thing above almost everything else: desiccation. Dry material pulls moisture from their bodies. Sprinkle a thin line of dry borax powder around the perimeter of your raised bed or garden row. Not on the plants, just the border. 1 application after rain or watering. A neighbor of mine, a man who's been farming the same 40 acres outside of Kentucky for going on 43 years, showed me this the first spring I had my own garden. He said his father's generation used straight wood ash, which works on the same principle. Borax works better and lasts longer. 3. Fleas in carpet and pet bedding. Sprinkle borax lightly and evenly across the carpet. Work it in gently with a broom so it settles down into the fibers where flea eggs and larvae live. Leave it for several hours. My grandfather's notebook says at least half a day, longer if you can stand it. Then vacuum thoroughly. Repeat once a week for 3 weeks to break the hatching cycle. Oregon State University's Integrated Pest Management Program has written about this exact approach. No fog, no chemical smell, no having to leave your house for 4 hours while something aerosols into every corner. 4. Cockroaches in kitchen cabinets. Mix equal parts borax and white sugar. Add just enough water to make a thick paste. Roll small pea-sized balls of it and place them in the backs of cabinets, under the refrigerator, along the edges of the space under the sink, anywhere dark and warm where they travel at night. Same mechanism as the ant bait. They eat it, carry it back, share it. The nest takes the hit. I've read accounts in old farming almanacs from the 1930s where this same basic mixture was listed as standard household practice. It never stopped working. We just stopped doing it. 5. Boron deficiency in the soil. This one surprises people the first time they hear it. Plants need boron as a micronutrient, and a lot of American garden soil, especially in the mid-Atlantic and southeastern states, is genuinely deficient. Symptoms are hollow stems on broccoli and cauliflower, distorted new growth at the tips, poor fruit set on apples and pears. UC Agriculture and Natural Resources has published research on this for years. The fix is a diluted borax solution. 1 tablespoon of borax dissolved in 5 gallons of water, applied once to the soil around the plant, not more than once per season. My grandfather had a note next to his brassica rose with exactly that ratio. He didn't know the science behind it. He just knew what worked. 6. Termites in wooden structures. This is a treatment for exposed wood, fence posts, the underside of porch boards, outbuilding framing. Dissolve 1 cup of borax in 1 gallon of hot water. Let it cool slightly, then apply it to bare wood with a paintbrush. Let it soak in and dry. It doesn't kill a mature infestation overnight, nothing honest will, but as a preventive treatment on new wood or as a surface application on at-risk areas, it makes the wood inhospitable. Termites avoid boron-treated wood the way you avoid a road you know is washed out. 7. Powdery mildew on squash and cucumbers. Late summer, you start seeing that white dusty coating on the leaves of your cucurbits. Mix 2 tablespoons of borax into 1 gallon of water and spray it onto affected leaves in the early morning so it has time to dry before evening. Research published through several land-grant universities has confirmed borax as an effective antifungal treatment in the garden. My grandfather's notebook just says, white dust on squash, borax water, morning spray, 3 days. Same instruction, different century. 8. Broadleaf weeds in walkways and gravel. Apply dry borax heavily and evenly across the area where you want nothing to grow. Rake it lightly into the surface. Water it in gently. Borax in high concentration is toxic to most plant life. It becomes a soil sterilant at saturation. This is not for garden beds or lawn. This is for gravel paths, between patio stones, along fence lines. 1 application in spring can hold a pathway clear through most of the summer. 9. Mice finding entry points. Mice don't eat borax willingly the way insects do, but they hate the smell and texture of it. Pack dry borax into gaps around pipe entries, along the bottom of door frames, inside wall spaces where you found evidence of travel. It won't replace sealing the gap properly. That's still the real fix. But as a deterrent and a short-term barrier while you work on the permanent repair, it buys you time and keeps them from settling in. 10. Wireworms attacking root vegetables. These are the larvae of click beetles, and they're a nightmare in potato beds. They move through the soil eating tubers from below, and you often don't know they're there until harvest. Work borax into the soil at a rate of about 1 pound per 1,000 square feet before planting, mixed thoroughly into the top 6 inches. Oregon State's Extension Service has documented this approach for wireworm management in commercial potato production. My grandfather used it on his potato rows without knowing the Latin name for the pest. He just called them rustworms and knew what they hated. 11. Codling moth on apple trees. This is the one almost nobody knows about anymore. The codling moth is the reason for the worm in the apple, larvae that hatch from eggs laid on the fruit and burrow straight to the core. The old-timers handled it with a borax spray applied to the trunk and scaffold branches in early spring before bloom, when the overwintering pupae are still in their cocoons in the bark. 2 tablespoons of borax per gallon of water applied with a pump sprayer to the bark surface. I found this in my grandfather's notebook on a page that had been folded over and tucked behind another page, like he'd set it aside. I don't know if that was intentional or if it just ended up there over time, but when I unfolded it and read it, he'd written at the bottom, "They took this out of the extension bulletins after the war. Don't forget it." I don't know exactly what he meant by that. I've looked into it. There's some evidence that as commercial orcharding became more industrialized in the post-war years, the advice given to home growers shifted steadily toward proprietary sprays and away from mineral treatments that anyone could buy at a hardware store for almost nothing. Whether that was intentional or just the natural drift of an industry moving toward profit, I'll leave that for you to decide. What I know is that the apple tree in my grandfather's yard produced clean fruit for decades, and the only thing he put on its trunk each spring was a bucket of water and a box of something that cost less than $1. Write your state and your worst pest in the comments. I'll answer every single one. Before I tell you about Hank Dorsey, I want to tell you about 20 mules. In 1872, a man named Francis Marion Smith began mining a white mineral from the floor of Death Valley in California. The conditions were about as hostile as anything on this continent. Temperatures that could kill a man before noon, no water, no shade, nothing soft for miles in any direction. To get the mineral out, they loaded it onto wagons pulled by teams of 20 mules at a time and hauled it across 165 miles of desert to the nearest railroad. 20 mules. 165 miles, just to bring out this white powder that people needed. That mineral was borax. The same thing that's been sitting on your laundry shelf. The same thing my grandfather kept in a paper bag. The same thing that costs $2 at any hardware store in this country today, because the deposit they found in that valley was so vast and so pure that 150 years of pulling it out of the ground hasn't come close to exhausting it. I tell you that story for one reason. This is not some folk remedy that was dreamed up in a barn somewhere. This is a mineral with a longer commercial history in America than most of the companies that now sell you pest control products. It was trusted by miners, by farmers, by households across the country for generations before anyone invented a plastic spray bottle or a quarterly service contract. The knowledge didn't disappear because something better came along. It disappeared because something more profitable came along. There's a difference. Now, the warning on the package. I want to talk about this directly because I think it's the thing that makes people hesitate, and I understand why. You pick up a box of borax, you read the back, and there are caution statements. Keep away from children. Avoid prolonged skin contact. Don't ingest. My grandfather had a way of explaining this that I've never heard bettered. He'd say, "It's like a hot stove. You don't avoid the kitchen. You just don't put your hand on the burner." That's it. That's the whole philosophy. Borax is not inert. Nothing useful is completely inert. Salt in large quantities is toxic. Vinegar in high concentration will damage skin. Water in the wrong situation can kill you. The question is never whether something can cause harm. The question is whether you're using it in a way that the harm is possible. And for the applications I described, used in the proportions I gave you, the answer is no. You are not being reckless. You are being exactly as careful as the situation requires, no more and no less. The dose makes the difference. That's not a new idea. That's a principle that goes back to Paracelsus in the 16th century, and it's the foundation of every honest conversation about chemistry. The companies that sell you alternatives are not selling you something without risk. They're selling you something where the risks are printed in smaller type and the marketing is louder. I'm not anti-science. I'm not telling you to throw out every product under your sink and live like it's 1912. What I'm saying is that the habit of reaching for a bottle before reaching for a bag of something simple and old and proven, that habit costs you money, and it costs you something harder to measure, which is the feeling of competence, the feeling of knowing what to do. Which brings me to Hank Dorsey. Hank farmed outside of Carbondale, Illinois for 58 seasons. I mean that literally, 58 growing seasons on the same land, starting when he was 19 years old and ending only because his knees finally told him they were done. He raised a family on that farm, put 3 kids through school, fixed his own equipment, grew most of his own food, and in 58 years of farming, never once signed up for a pest control service. I met him through a mutual friend about 7 years ago. He was in his late 70s then, sharp as anyone I've talked to, with the kind of quietness that comes from having spent most of your life outside and alone with your thoughts. We sat on his porch for about 2 hours, and I asked him questions, and he answered them slowly and completely, the way people do when they're not trying to impress anyone. I asked him what his system was, how he'd managed 58 seasons without the kind of product dependency that most growers fall into eventually. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I make about 6 decisions a year. Everything else takes care of itself." 6 decisions. I asked him what they were, and some of them were things specific to his land and his crops. But the last one was this. He said that every time something went wrong, a pest, a disease, a weed problem, a nutrient issue, his first move was always to the cupboard. Not the catalog, not the phone. The cupboard. "If I can't fix it with what's already in the barn," he said, "then I'll go looking. But most of the time, I don't have to go looking." He tapped the arm of his chair with one finger when he said that last part, like he was making sure it landed. It landed. That's the shift I want to leave you with. Not a product, not a technique, though the techniques in Part 2 are real, and they work. The shift is in where you look first. The pantry before the catalog, the barn before the phone call, the $2 box before the $40 bottle. Your grandparents weren't more frugal because they were poor. Some of them were, and some of them weren't. They were more frugal because they were more confident. They knew what they had. They knew what it could do. And they moved through their land and their homes with the quiet assurance of people who had never been taught to distrust their own shelves. That knowledge is recoverable. It didn't die. It just stopped being passed down for a generation or two, and now some of us are doing the passing. If this was useful to you, subscribe. There's more where this came from. Next time we're talking about something that's been sitting in your kitchen cabinet even longer than borax, and what it can do for your soil in the fall. Leave a comment. Tell me your state, tell me your problem, and I'll see you in the replies. Hank would have wanted you to check the cupboard first.